Trump has talked about sending out $2,000 checks to U.S. citizens. Earlier this year, he also talked about sending a Doge dividend. That didn't materialize. Should U.S. Citizens expect a $2,000 proposal? Is the White House committed to making that happen?
The White House is committed to making that happen, yes.
President Donald Trump has made a bold promise, a dividend of at least $2,000 for most Americans, funded by tariff revenues. He posted this on his Truth Social account and framed it as a reward, a way to give back to the people. But what exactly is he proposing? Who would qualify? And most importantly, is it realistic? In this video, we're going to break it all down, the background of the plan, how it's supposed to work, the biggest red flags, and the key stakeholders. If you're wondering whether this $2,000 check is real or just political theater, you're in the right place. Trump in his November 9th speech said a dividend of at least $2,000 a person, not including high-income people, will be paid to everyone. This is not me saying this. I am quoting his words. This is what he said. But pay attention to what he said. He said this $2,000 check is excluding high-income people. He's calling this a tariff dividend, meaning the money would come from revenues generated by import tariffs. Donald Trump's $2,000 tariff dividend proposal sounds simple on the surface. America charges tariffs on foreign imports, collects the money, and then hands a chunk of it back to the public. Like a company paying dividends to its shareholders, Trump frames the United States as if it's a big national corporation and every working American is an investor who deserves a return. In his own words, he promised a dividend of at least $2,000 per person, excluding people in the high-income bracket. It's bold, catchy, and politically powerful, the kind of short, punchy promise that travels fast. But once you lift the hood and look at the machinery inside the proposal, the picture becomes much more complicated. First, Trump hasn't defined what high income means. To a politician, high income can mean anything from $75,000 a year to over $500,000, depending on the political winds. Without an income cutoff, it's impossible to tell how many Americans would actually qualify for this dividend. Depending on the brackets chosen, the eligible population could range from roughly half the adult population to almost everyone except the top 5%. This ambiguity creates both flexibility and confusion, allowing the administration to appeal to a broad audience without committing to specific numbers. Another key point is how the dividend would actually be delivered. The average American might imagine a physical check arriving in the mail or a direct deposit hitting their account. That's the mental picture the phrase $2,000 check evokes. But Trump's own economic advisors, including Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, have already signaled that the real mechanism may look quite different. Instead of writing checks, the government might distribute the $2,000 through the tax system. That could mean refundable tax credits, expanded deductions, reduced payroll taxes, or eliminating federal taxes on certain types of income, overtime pay, tips, or Social Security benefits, for example. For many people, especially retirees or low-income workers, the form in which the money arrives matters a lot. A direct check is immediate. A tax credit only shows up when you file next year's taxes. And a deduction saves money only if you earn enough to owe tax in the first place. Trump's language also introduces another layer. He frames the tariff dividend as just one part of a larger economic strategy. In the same breath, he claims tariffs will generate so much revenue that the government will not only pay Americans their dividend, but also reduce the national debt. If taken literally, this suggests a massive surplus of tariff income enough to write hundreds of billions in dividends and still have billions left over to throw at the debt. Economists on both sides have raised eyebrows at this idea, pointing out that tariff revenue, while substantial, is only a fraction of the trillions involved in the U.S. budget. In reality, for tariffs to fund both a nationwide dividend and debt reduction, they would have to be set at extremely high rates or applied to an enormous volume of imports. Conditions that could affect consumer prices and potentially fuel inflation if not balanced carefully. Another question buried beneath the promise is whether Congress needs to be involved. Presidents can adjust tariffs to a point, but direct cash payments, tax changes, and broad financial benefits for the public normally require legislative approval. Some legal scholars believe that a $2,000 dividend, especially one going to tens of millions of people, cannot be rolled out by executive action alone. If Congress has to play along, then the fate of the proposal depends on the political environment. A divided Congress could stall or reshape the idea entirely, turning a simple promise into a legislative battle. There's also the matter of who counts as everyone. Trump's post uses broad language but does not specify whether the dividend includes dependents, children, college students, undocumented workers, green card holders, gig workers who don't file regular taxes, or seniors on Social Security and SSI. His supporters often interpret everyone literally, but administration officials have given no such guarantee. Without details, the proposal behaves like a projection screen. People see what they hope for. A retiree imagines a $2,000 check. A single mother imagines a payment for both herself and her kids. A low-wage worker imagines instant relief. Yet none of this is clearly spelled out. The most politically explosive misunderstanding comes from Social Security and disability beneficiaries. Online rumors have circulated claiming Trump has signed $2,000 checks for SSI payees, but the administration has not confirmed any special payout for Social Security or disability recipients. For now, SSI/SSDI beneficiaries are in the same ambiguous zone as everyone else, potentially eligible depending on income, but not guaranteed anything. The administration hasn't published rules, formulas, eligibility charts, or a rollout timeline. In short, the promise remains a general idea, not an implemented policy. Even the term dividend carries strategic ambiguity. In corporate finance, a dividend is normally a cash payment. But in politics, a dividend can be metaphorical, relief that arrives through lower taxes or reduced expenses. Officials hinting at tax credits and deductions suggest the government is leaving multiple doors open. For wealthy Americans who might be excluded from the dividend entirely, tax policy changes could serve as a political cushion. Everyone hears something they like. Underneath all this is a deeper political story. Trump is trying to flip the traditional tariff narrative. Usually, tariffs are viewed as taxes that increase the cost of imported goods, a burden that ultimately falls on consumers. The Trump team is trying to rebrand tariffs as a wealth-generating engine, almost like an investment vehicle. The message is, tariffs punish foreign competitors, money pours into the U.S. Treasury, and Americans reap the rewards. Whether this logic holds up economically is a separate question, but as a political story, it's powerful. It taps into a desire for fairness, national pride, and direct economic relief at a time of inflation, high rent, and rising costs. The heart of Trump's $2,000 dividend idea rests on a simple claim. Tariff revenue will be large enough to cover payments to most Americans. But when you run the numbers, the picture becomes much trickier than the slogan suggests. During Trump's first term, annual tariff revenue peaked at around $90 billion. Even if a second-term tariff system doubled or tripled this amount, the total still falls short of what would be needed for a nationwide payout. A $2,000 dividend to 120 million adults, for example, would cost roughly $240 billion. If the payments extended to more than 150 million people, the cost climbs past $300 billion. Suddenly, tariffs have to become supercharged just to reach the starting line. On top of that, Trump has promised not just the dividend, but also using remaining tariff revenue to reduce the national debt. This creates a mathematical squeeze. If tariffs generate $100 to $200 billion a year, and the dividend alone requires more than that, then there is no leftover money for debt reduction. To make both promises true at the same time, tariffs would have to bring in historically unprecedented revenue. That means higher tariff rates, tariffs on more categories of goods, or aggressive taxes on imports from China and other major exporters. Each of these moves carries economic consequences, including higher costs for consumers and friction in global trade, which could offset some of the financial gains. There's another layer. Tariff revenue isn't guaranteed or fixed. If tariffs rise sharply, importers often reduce the volume of goods they bring in. That means the revenue can drop even when the tax rate goes up. Economists call this the elasticity of trade, but in simple human terms, it means people adjust. Companies find new suppliers, shift production to different countries, or cut back on imports entirely. The U.S. might earn a rush of money early on, but sustaining a high enough level to fund permanent annual dividends is far from certain. Promising a recurring $2,000 payment requires stable, predictable income, something tariffs historically do not provide. The final complication is distribution. If the dividend is truly given to everyone except high-income people, the cost becomes enormous. If the cutoff is lower, say around $75,000 to $100,000, the eligible population shrinks and the math becomes more manageable. But politically, excluding tens of millions of middle-class Americans risks backlash. So the administration is walking a tightrope, set the income limit high enough to keep people happy, but low enough to keep the math within reach. So far, no official numbers have been released, likely because any concrete figure exposes the gap between the promise and the available revenue. That tension, the difference between political appeal and financial reality, is the core question behind whether the numbers truly add up. The promise of a $2,000 dividend sounds like something that would arrive the way past stimulus checks did, deposited straight into bank accounts or mailed as a U.S. Treasury check. But so far, Trump's team has been far more cautious about describing how the money would actually reach people. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has repeatedly hinted that this may not be a traditional stimulus-style payout. Instead of sending physical checks, the administration might deliver the benefit through the tax system. That means the money could show up as a refundable credit during tax season, as a cut to payroll taxes, or as an exemption from certain federal taxes. These are all radically different experiences for the average person. A check in the hand feels immediate. A tax credit feels like waiting in line at the DMV, eventually helpful, but not exactly thrilling in the moment. This uncertainty creates a strange gap between public expectation and administrative reality. When a politician says $2,000 for every American, people picture a direct payment they can use instantly for rent, groceries, or overdue bills. They imagine something tangible. But when the government shifts toward tax credits or deductions, the benefit becomes more abstract. A tax deduction, for example, only helps if you owe taxes in the first place. Millions of seniors, students, part-time workers, and low-income earners either owe very little or nothing at all. For them, a deduction worth $2,000 on paper might translate to only a few $100s or nothing. That's why the structure matters as much as the promise itself. If the administration instead uses refundable tax credits, the payout becomes more equal. Even people with no tax liability could receive the full amount. That would more closely mirror the stimulus checks sent during the pandemic. But refundable credits require clear legislation, budget authorization, and an entire infrastructure to process payments. The IRS would need extra funding and new systems, especially if the payout becomes annual rather than one time. These implementation details are invisible to the public, but they determine whether the money arrives in weeks or in months. Politically, a delay can turn enthusiasm into frustration, which is likely why officials avoid making hard commitments about delivery timelines. Then there is the looming question of whether the dividend would be annual, quarterly, or a one-time event. Trump's language suggests something recurring, a national return fueled by ongoing tariff revenue, but implementing a permanent annual payment is far more complex than issuing a single check. A single check can be rushed out, even if imperfectly. A recurring $2,000 benefit requires stable funding and a predictable system that can support tens of millions of payments every year. If tariffs fluctuate, the government may struggle to guarantee consistent dividends, and modifying the amount each year would create confusion. Until the administration publishes a clear payment structure, the delivery mechanism remains a puzzle with more missing pieces than solved ones. The truth is that seniors and disabled Americans are often placed at the crossroads of big political promises. Every few years, a dramatic new proposal sweeps through the headlines with talk of relief, stimulus, or economic justice, and the public is left wondering whether this time the promise is real or just another rhetorical firework. A $2,000 national dividend checks all the boxes of a crowd pleaser: simple, direct, emotionally satisfying. But the gap between promising a check and delivering one is wide enough to march an entire congressional committee through. While older voters might appreciate the attention, many have lived through enough political hype cycles to know that caution is a form of self-preservation. They want clarity, not confusion, reality, not wishful soundbites. Expectations matter here. When people hear Social Security recipients will receive $2,000 checks, it triggers a spark of hope that can quickly become frustration if the proposal stalls. It's not just a policy issue, it touches personal budgets, rent payments, medical bills, and grocery lists. For someone living on $1,200 a month, an extra $2,000 isn't politics, it's a life raft. That's why the messaging around these promises has to be handled with a surgeon's precision. Anything vague or exaggerated risks setting off a wave of misinformation, feeding scams, and stirring up anxiety among vulnerable groups who are already navigating financial tightropes. The impact of political promises isn't measured only in votes. It's measured in the emotional whiplash experienced by people hanging on every update. For seniors and SSI beneficiaries, the bigger question isn't the check itself, it's economic stability. Prices have climbed, rents have jumped like caffeinated kangaroos, and medical costs creep upward with a kind of quiet, relentless determination. A one-time dividend